In part one of this series, I asked why Jesus had to die. As previously stated, I'm sure there's more than one reason, but there is one particular reason I wish to point out in this series. Hopefully, I'll do that by the end of this study. In part one, I ended with a brief overview of the temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, proposing that the reason for the fall was love. That is to say, a love for the self. An interesting point in this temptation story that aligns with Gemini's previous breakdown of the phrase fallen in love are the statements loss of control. In the medieval mind, falling was something that happened to you, not something you did. It categorized love as a surrender of the will, the fall from grace. And again, there's a subtle theological link to the fall of man. Falling into love implied a descent from a state of cold, hard logic into a state of emotional vulnerability or folly. Here we are, my friend. The last statement is especially revealing. Emotional vulnerability. That sounds like a heart issue, doesn't it? Might this be why the temptation of the serpent involves the woman as opposed to the man? In fact, the Hebrew word for woman, also rendered wife, is used 13 times in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, while the name Eve doesn't even appear until Genesis 3:20. My point? This isn't a gender issue. Think inward, not outward. Adam is indicative of the mind, while Eve, the heart. The point being that when we fall in love with the self, it is much more a matter of heart than mind, of an emotional vulnerability as opposed to a psychological capability. To put it in plain terms, the formation of pride or act of falling in love with the self is, what Gemini says, is a sudden, overwhelming sickness or divine stumble that overthrows reason, suggesting a loss of agency, an accidental downward motion that you cannot control. Ever hear the phrase, swept me off my feet? Gemini says this phrase traces its roots back to the mid-19th century, evolving from a literal physical description into the romantic idiom we use today. It centers on the idea of a force so sudden or overwhelming that it removes one's stability. Now, that just about sums it up, doesn't it? It also gives a deeper meaning to 1 Corinthians 2:14 that says, "The natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them because they're spiritually discerned." We come into this world as a natural person, unable to discern spiritual things. Is it any wonder then that we fall in love with the self, with the idea of who we think we are based on our human form and this world of form in which we've entered? Do I sound a bit crazy in all of this? Well, I'm not. After all, didn't Jesus say we should love our neighbor as ourself? It's a given. We love ourselves, and we should. But herein lies the problem. We love ourselves too much. That's the definition of pride in Romans 12:3, where Paul tells us not to think more highly of ourselves than we should. Thinking more highly is the male aspect, while loving the self is the female aspect, and both work within our being. Now we can understand why God said, "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife." No, not the woman on the outside, but the emotional vulnerability on the inside. And no wonder Paul said that Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Our fall, as it were, involves both male and female. To say it plainly, it takes love to overcome love. Our love for light greater than our love for darkness. This is the principle of self-denial, where we are challenged to lay down our lives for Christ and others. And there can be no doubt, to love Christ and others as much or more than we love ourselves is the real path to happiness. This, I believe, is the truth that makes us free. All of this brings me to the one point I wish to make above all others about why Jesus had to die. If you're familiar with the Old Testament stories, then you know that God chose many different individuals at different times to further his purpose. Enoch comes to mind, so too Noah, and of course Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who became Israel, and Moses, King David, and Solomon. Of course, there are many others, but you get the point. What's truly amazing about the prophecies concerning Christ is this. Long before God brought his Son into the world, he let the prophets of Israel know he intended to do so. And not only did these prophecies point to Christ, they also spoke of the fact that he would suffer and die. Imagine being a father who knows that before his son is even born, he will pass through intense suffering and die at the hands of those he sent him to. No wonder John says, God is love. And that's the point. God did not choose someone flawed like those Christ died for. From the very beginning, our Father never intended to use someone outside the framework of his own flesh and blood, if you will. John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Not a stranger, not someone he simply chose from among many, but his Son, his only Son. And speaking of Christ Jesus as our great high priest who has passed through the heavens, the writer of Hebrews states, For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Well, here we are, Jesus, God's only Son, tempted in all things, yet without sin. I'm reminded of what Paul says in Romans. We read, Look at it this way. At the right time, while we were still helpless, Christ died for ungodly people. Finding someone who would die for a godly person is rare. Maybe someone would have the courage to die for a good person. Christ died for us while we were still sinners. This demonstrates God's love for us. Christ died for us while we were ungodly, still sinners, and certainly not worth dying for. Why? In order to demonstrate God's love for us. The sinless died for the sinful, the flawless for the flawed, the perfect for the imperfect, the most powerful for the powerless. And that's the most incredible thing. Jesus had the power to stop everything in a moment of time in whatever way he chose. Did he not tell Peter during his betrayal by Judas, Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? Yes, Peter, I can stop this. With just a word, our Father will send 12 legions of angels. But no, not going to happen. My love for the Father and my love for others is greater than my desire to hold on to this life. Ask yourself, did Jesus know he was demonstrating the Father's love by dying for the world? I believe he did, for he was possessed by this love. Now, ask yourself this. Knowing that Christ had all the power and wouldn't use it, no sin but didn't consider it, might this not demonstrate the most precious thing of all? And what might this be? That God's love is unconditional. Therefore, he had to have a perfect sacrifice to show it. And so his Son's death was this perfect sacrifice because it demonstrates this unconditional love. A good man might have failed in this, but a perfect man, a man begotten of God with all the power of heaven and earth at his disposal, who, because of this unconditional love, laid every bit of it down. So I cannot help but believe that when Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, God did. And not only those who murdered his Son, but everyone, past, present, and future, once and for all. For that, dear friend, is his nature, and that is what his Son demonstrated. Just once, Christ died on the cross, and just once, our Father forgave. And that was all that was necessary, for both embrace eternity.